everybody, and welcome to Conserving Catholicism. My name is Nick, and today I am joined by Dr. Michael Gorman. And Dr. Michael Gorman is zooming in from DC, but Dr. Gorman, this is your first time on the podcast, so if you could maybe just give us a little bit of introduction about yourself, where you're from.
Yeah. Hi. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Michael Gorman again. I teach philosophy at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I've been teaching here for 25 years now. And I grew up in the D.C. area. I'm one of those lucky fluke academics who actually ends up settling in the same area that he grew up in. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, well, it's a lovely area. Having been there for a year, I enjoy it quite a bit. So that's wonderful. And today we're talking about your new book, A Contemporary Introduction to Thomistic Metaphysics, which is a phenomenal book. And by way of introduction, I wanted to just first ask you kind of what was your initial introduction to Aquinas? What initially attracted you to his thought?
I think I'm sure that I first encountered Aquinas in a very small dose. In high school, we had a really, I was very lucky to have a very good, they had a really good religion program in my high school. Back in those dark days when almost nobody did. We were very fortunate. And so I know that I read a little bit of Aquinas then, but I don't know that it stuck, In my undergraduate studies at the University of Toronto, I had some Aquinas in a few classes, including a class that I took my sophomore year with Barry Brown, where we spent like 8 or 9 weeks just reading On Being and Essence. So it's this tiny little book that we spent forever on, and it was super fun. I was really excited, but I have to admit, at the same time, I had this kind of I don't know, it's sort of too dramatic to say love-hate relationship with Aquinas. I liked Aquinas, but I kept running into people for whom studying Aquinas seemed to, whenever you would talk to them about philosophy, they just wanted to talk about what Aquinas thought. I thought, that's cool, but what about what's true, And in part, I'm sure I was being unfair. But in part, it is sort of an issue because when you spend a lot of time with a thinker of genius like that, you can just get sort of overwhelmed. But you have to learn to keep doing philosophy and theology yourself, because if you don't, I don't know, the point is lost. So I was back. I would be sometimes reading Aquinas and sometimes not, back and forth. But when I was doing my last leg of graduate studies in theology, I ended up writing a dissertation on Aquinas's theory of the hypostatic union, and I found that a very exciting and worthwhile experience. And so, from that point on, quite steadily, I've always had at least one little leg in Aquinas, either studying him sort of historically to figure out what he thought, or to figure out ways to engage his thought in ways where it could be brought together in dialogue with contemporary thought. Sometimes he has something special that contemporary people need to hear.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as an undergraduate, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in philosophy, I remember most of the philosophy classes that I took were primarily modern analytic type philosophy. And so I felt that at this point, we kind of went over Aquinas maybe briefly in our history of ancient and medieval philosophy class.
Right.
So it was like Aquinas was a little footnote in there. It was like, okay, but since Aristotle, nothing much happened until we get to Descartes, and then philosophy picked back up again. So I felt that during that undergraduate experience, there was something missing, even in contemporary discussions. I felt that there was just some piece that needed to kind of be filled, and I wasn't sure at the time whether it was a general just approach to philosophy that was the issue, if it was just missing pieces of the puzzle, or the puzzle itself. And so Thomas, my introduction to him, kind of was very eye-opening in that regard. And I think this is a great segue because your book, as it's titled, it's a contemporary introduction to
Right.
metaphysics. And so a lot of the book as well is written in a way where you have this dialogue amongst kind of, especially primarily analytic
Yes.
philosophers today. And in that sense, it's very helpful. So I wanted to also ask you as well, what was the kind of impetus for writing the book in this way, or having, because there are plenty of other introductions to Thomas as
Yeah.
well, and to metaphysics as well more broadly. So what was the impetus for writing this book now?
Well, I mean, it had been for a pretty long time, actually. Um, in part of my graduate studies in philosophy, I ended up using, well, in my philosophy dissertation, I ended up, I'm just remembering this now, it's been a while. I ended up using, investigating some contemporary analytic disputes and then trying to resolve them using some ideas from John Duns Scotus. So you wouldn't call that analytic Thomism, but you might call it analytic Scotism. I don't know. Anyway, it was the sort of thing where Aquinas and Scotus basically agree. It just happens to be laid out really well in Scotus, and that's where I stumbled across it. So I've been interested for a long time in this business of comparing medieval philosophy um, with contemporary philosophy. And a lot of other people do that too, right? But it's been kind of a thing that a lot of people have been doing. Now, but somewhat more immediately, at Catholic U, I have been teaching a course. It's part of our honors program sequence, the fourth philosophy course in the honors program philosophy sequence. I'm not explaining this very well, but like if you're in the honors program, you could take 4 courses in a row in philosophy, and the fourth one is a metaphysics course. And I had been, partly because I thought it would be good for our students, and partly because it was what I was interested in doing, I taught it in a way that introduced the students to Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, but also in comparison with and in dialogue with contemporary analytic philosophy. And over the course of teaching that, maybe I'd been teaching it about 8 years, and I realized that I had developed my own approach to the material. I had been using a different textbook, a good one, but I noticed at a certain point that I wasn't using it as much anymore. I was like assigning it, but I wasn't engaging it as much. And I realized, aha, that's because I have my own way of thinking about all of this. And so I even said to my students one day in class, maybe I should write my own book. And they said, yeah, you should do that. I thought, okay, I'll do it. So the next time I taught the course, I actually assigned a preliminary draft. And when the semester started, it wasn't totally finished, so I had to scramble a bit, which was exciting. And but I test drove it on them, and then I did it the following year, and then at that point it was in pretty good shape. So the story's more complicated than that, but it grew out of my own teaching. That's the point I'm trying to make here.
That's great. And it definitely shows. I mean, to be able to, I'm still obviously a novice in thinking through Thomas's thought, but to be able to kind of present it in that way and figure out your own way of formulating things shows a real mastery of the material, and definitely shows throughout the text, in both that it's just very high level in for an introduction as well, but also very engaging, and it shows that this is someone
Yes.
who commands has good command of the material, but can also teach it in such a way that it has a very pedagogical approach
Well,
throughout.
I often feel that if I can't explain something in a very basic, down to earth way, then that's probably because I don't actually understand it. I've just learned which expressions to use. Uh, and this is something that happens sometimes. You get into a philosophical groove, and you learn all the things that you're supposed to say.
Mhm.
Uh, but so then if you just make yourself stop and repeat everything without any technical expressions and give very down to earth examples, if you can't do it, you probably don't know what you mean. So
That's right. That's right. Well, it's a good thing I have you here then, because I'll be asking you as well some questions now about the content of the book, and there are definitely some parts that it's I think I read this about a month ago, maybe now, or 2 months ago when it first came out. So I still have some of it there, but other pieces I'm still missing. So you can maybe help me walk through it as we go along. But in terms of your approach, you mentioned that this book is really kind of a reflection of the ways in which you've thought about Thomas's metaphysics. And with that, the way you frame the book is focusing on his metaphysics as a substance centered metaphysics. And so, what is the advantages? Yeah, and you mentioned obviously too that there are obviously different ways in which you can enter into Thomas
Right.
or Aristotle's metaphysical thought. So this isn't the only way of doing it. And in fact, I think most of the times when I've been introduced to like an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, the first thing that most people harp on is act and potency. This is
Right.
what divides being, and so this is the most basic distinction that needs to be known. But this substance approach obviously has a lot going for it, and so I wanted to know if you could just speak a little bit more to
Yeah.
why you begin with substance.
Aristotle says, and Aquinas follows him. I mean, Aquinas likes this idea and uses it too. That what typically happens when we're trying to investigate some subject matter is that we start with things that are familiar to us, even though they're a bit messy, and then we advance towards concepts and realities that have within themselves perhaps even a higher degree of intelligibility, but they're less familiar to us from the start. And I think the things that are most familiar to us in our experience are substances. So the way I understand substance is that, well, first of all, I should just say it in a very non-technical way, something that you would call a thing is often a good example of a substance, especially a living thing. Those are the best examples of substances. So like a squirrel or a cat or a horse or something like that. Now, then I try to spell them out a little bit. So first of all, they're individuals. And second of all, they are independent. So meaning what? Well, if you take like, okay, so here's, I don't know, is this on screen now? This
Yeah.
pencil? Yeah, it has to be. This pencil is yellow. Now, the color of the pencil needs the pencil. It needs to be in the pencil in order to exist. So it's a dependent being in a certain way. But substances are not dependent in that way. They exist on their own. So, a squirrel's activity of chattering or eating nuts or something, that's real. It's real, but it depends on the squirrel. It needs the squirrel. It's in the squirrel, you might say. But the squirrel itself is just kind of there on its own. So um, so that's the second thing that makes a substance a substance. It's independent. And the third is that it's unified. All the parts of a substance kind of hang together so that it's really a whole. It's not just like a pile of sand or something like that. So independent, unified individuals are an initial way of characterizing substances. And I think those are the most familiar things to us. And I think it's a helpful way of understanding Aquinas' metaphysics like this. Reality consists of either substances or things that are somehow related to substances. So the qualities of substances or the activities of substances, things like that. I just find it a useful way of organizing the material, and it helps you to start with something that, in a sense, you already know.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I can, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just pushing back a little bit
No,
to inquire.
feel
So
free to disagree.
yeah. So Thomas, following Aristotle is
Yeah.
going to say that everything that we learn, we first learn through the senses.
Yes.
Now, it doesn't seem that we have any, and I think you state this in your book, that we don't have any direct contact with substances. Where we have direct contact with is accidents. So I don't necessarily see you,
Yeah,
but I see, your color and your shape and your size and all these things. So how so while granting, let's say that substances, yes, are the most basic beings, um, how would we say that this kind of substance approach jives with the idea that we first learn anything through what's
yeah.
evident to us, and substances aren't those kinds of things.
That's a really good question, which I don't really engage um, very deeply in the book. Um, I have to say, and I know that there are some things in Aquinas where he seems to go against what I'm about to say, but I think it's complicated. Um, I think it's probably a misleading picture to say that what I look around and I see colors and I hear sounds and I feel textures, and then I somehow construct the notion of substance or reason my way to a substance. I think I see colored things
Hmm.
or I hear noisy things. Now, this is a difficult problem. I think in a way that what we experience, well, okay, so let me just say again what I said, and I think I know the next step to take. So we see colored things or we hear noisy things, and in a way, we haven't yet made the distinction between substances and their accidental qualities. We just have an experience of a colored thing. Now, if you think about it, then at a certain point you can make a distinction between the substance as, a freestanding unified individual and its qualities, which are, so to speak, parts of it. But I don't think we start with the parts and then assemble the whole.
Hmm.
And partly because I think you can't do that. Like if you start with the parts as parts, well, if you start with the parts not as parts, if you just say, well, I've got colors and textures and sounds, there's no way to assemble them into wholes. Although people try to think of philosophy that way, but I don't think that actually works.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that relates to one of the dangers that you mentioned in your book of reifying certain things
Yes.
that aren't reifiable, if you will.
Yeah.
So you don't interact with just yellowness, let's say.
Yes.
You're interacting with the thing that is yellow. And you kind of take this approach with multiple different subjects throughout the book, which I think is very important. And for instance, even with essence and existence,
Mhm.
this kind of danger of reifying essence
Yes.
as its own thing, and it's not just kind of things that you're two things that are already existing that you end up putting together in some way.
Right.
That's the way that it sometimes gets looked at.
It turns out it's a very difficult topic and one that I'm continuing to think about because at one extreme you can think of the qualities or the essences or whatever of objects as if they were sort of already there, and then you assemble them into substances, kind of like Legos. And that's not going to work. Now, when you try to avoid that, you can go too far to the opposite extreme and then end up saying that the only things that have any kind of reality at all are substances, and qualities and essences just don't have any reality at all. And I don't think that's right either. But the middle view is actually very, very difficult to state. They're real, um, and they belong to the substance. They're of the substance. But well, I think that what we're really good at thinking about is substances, and so we just naturally fall into turning everything into substance in order to think about it. But so it requires us. It sort of forces us way out of our intellectual comfort zone to try to think about accidents and essences and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want to in the last chapter of your book, you bring up some of the kind of theological considerations
Yeah.
related to metaphysics. And but before we get there, and obviously this notion of substance is a very important one, especially within the two cases that you bring up as
Right.
well. Um, but wanted to kind of ask some about some other basic concepts that are also going to be important for that chapter and that discussion. Can you briefly kind of articulate what is the difference between a substance and its nature? So what is so yeah, as brief as you could.
Yeah.
But there's because it's one thing to say that okay, we understand that things are the most basic
Yeah.
things that there are, let's say for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to figuring out what exactly are those things, that's becomes a different story. We might say that okay, things are the most basic, but and we might have a loose kind of definition of what those things are: independent, unified, and individuals. But what meets that criteria becomes a little bit difficult. And it seems to me that the way in which you have to kind of um, explain this a little bit more is by appealing to the natures of things, while at the same time maintaining that there's a distinction between the nature and the thing itself.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see if I can find a good way to make sure. And like, if I'm not addressing your question, we can go through this again. Um, on the one, leaving aside the case of God, where everything just explodes. Every substance that you think of has a kind of interior multiplicity, or there's a word that I'm not coming up with right now, but they're complex. There's so if you think of a squirrel, it has a certain size, it has a certain color, it has a certain noise that it's making right now. So um, so there's this kind of interior multiplicity going on. Um, the Australian philosopher David Armstrong called this layer cake ontology. Like, things have like different layers to them, right? They're not just like, well, he contrasted that with blob ontology. So they aren't just like a completely homogeneous blob, but there's like layers or something. Okay. Now, that's already a start on seeing that substances are different from their qualities, because any quality you pick, there's more to the substance than that. And this is a place where Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy tends to deviate from standard analytic views. It's important to single out for every substance a very special, now I'll just call it a quality, but I'll take that back later, a very special quality that it has, and say this one is its essence. It's different from all the others. Now, what makes it different is something like this. If you take a squirrel, okay, wait, let me make it easier for myself by picking this totally classic example. So the classic example is to say that all human beings have the feature of being able to laugh, right? I mean, we've all maybe met people who that feature seems to be buried very deeply in their personality, but like, it's in there somewhere, right? Okay. So then you can say, why do people have this ability to laugh? Well, it turns out it's because we have reason, so we can get the joke. And then we have bodies of a certain sort that allow us to actually, haha. Okay. So you can explain this quality, the ability to laugh, in terms of more basic features of the substance. Well, you can't go down forever. So there must be something about the substance where it's just where it stops. And that place where it stops, the foundational feature, if you will, is its essence. So this is sort of short version of that. Now, I said that it's sort of like a quality, but sort of not. The problem is if you're not careful and you just call it a quality, then you might say, well, what has the quality? And that will give you the idea that deep inside of every substance, there's this tiny little metaphysical BB. It's like a little tiny rock, and all the qualities are added to it. except it's even worse than a BB or a little rock. It has no features. They have like very few features, but it has no features, right? So this is a thing that philosophers talk about. It's usually called a bare particular. I talk about this at length. I think for, Aquinas and Aristotle, that's not actually how it goes. For there to be an essence like for there to be a squirrelness, just is for there to be a squirrel. There's nothing that you add the squirrelness to. It constitutes the squirrel at its most basic level. So the most basic thing you get to is not a little thing that has squirrelness, but just a squirrel. And then all the other qualities or whatever, all the other features are layered onto that. Does that make? Am I addressing your question?
No, yeah, absolutely. Because I think even implicit probably within the way I phrased the question is the same danger that we just alluded to earlier of
Yeah,
the danger of reifying the substance such that it's, or I guess we should say, I'm not sure in this point if for reifying the substance or the nature, maybe both, but to say that you have this substance that doesn't have a nature or anything like that, and then
that's it.
you have this nature kind
Yeah,
of added onto it afterward.
yeah.
Whereas as you're saying, that's not the case. What the substance is in virtue of the nature that it has.
I
Um,
mean, if you want to reify anything, the substance is the thing you want to reify, right? To reify something just means to thingify it, and the primary and best sense of thing is going to be substances. But although you can conceptually sort of think of the substance, you can try anyway, to think of the substance apart from any features that it has. That doesn't mean that there is inside of it a little featureless nugget. That's just a leap from the way we can think about things to the way they actually are. We can sometimes conceptualize things in a way that it isn't that way. And I
yeah,
think this would be one of those cases.
yeah. So there's a distinction here then between, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but yeah, just the way that we kind of conceptualize the things that we interact with, the way the things actually are. So, for instance, with the individual substances we interact with, all those substances are going to have natures of some sort.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a substance that doesn't have a nature,
Yes.
reality, but we can um, conceptually conceive of the substances, and that's why you can have a seems in some sense a science of metaphysics is that because you can kind of abstract from
Hmm.
the individual natures and consider the substances just as substances, you're able to move along with that. Is that
Yes.
right?
Although part of your, yeah, so in metaphysics we end up with this, we deal with this extremely general um, notion of substance, which abstracts from all the differences between squirrels and horses and things like that. Um, but you wouldn't want to go so far that you, part of the notion of substance is that it has some nature or other.
Hmm.
And in fact, and we know enough about its nature to know that the substance is going to be individual and independent and unified.
Yeah,
But that's all. I mean,
yeah,
insofar as it's a substance, that's all.
yeah. No, that's right.
But
Uh,
nothing ever exists that way. It always exists in a fully determinate way as a squirrel or a horse or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and this is similar to in some sense, right, to matter. You can conceptually conceive, of
Yes.
matter in itself, but matter as such is always going to have some particular form
Yes.
whenever you encounter it.
That's right. There's something. This is maybe a dangerous analogy, but it's helpful too. If you think of, you're thinking of prime matter, right?
That's
But
right. Prime matter.
if
Yeah.
you think of a less fancy kind of matter, if you just think of like bronze, like what is the shape of bronze? There's no answer to that question.
Hmm.
Any piece of bronze has some shape or other. We sometimes say a shapeless piece of bronze, but what we actually mean there is just that the shape is so weird that we don't have a name for it, right? But it always has some shape. And yet, insofar as it's bronze, there's no particular shape that it needs to have. So you could say that bronze is in itself shapeless, but that you have to understand that in the right way. It doesn't mean that if we look hard enough, we can find a piece of bronze that has no shape. So in the same way, the concept of substance is neutral on all the different possible natures that substances can come in. But that doesn't mean that there are any substances that don't themselves have one nature or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was a good analogy with matter.
Yeah, no, but that's helpful to kind of clarify the analogy itself. Now we've been talking a lot about substance, and there's some sense in which it's hard to discuss substance, apart from giving a kind of a better understanding of accidents and what accidents
Yeah.
are. And so, in the book, you in the beginning give certain kind of preliminary definitions of substance and accidents, that are genuine definitions, and then you go throughout the book as well, kind of
Yeah.
clarify some of those things and what they mean. One of the features that accidents seem to have is this kind of dependence upon substance, where
Yeah.
substance is not dependent on anything else. And one of the things that I've found hard to articulate, and I think you do a great job of it in the book, but I wanted you to see if you can just comment on it a little bit further, is how do we distinguish the dependence that accidents have on their substance versus what created substances have upon God? Uh,
Yes.
and
Yes.
you can go through that a little bit more, because I think it becomes a little bit difficult once you realize, oh, okay, we can say accidents depend on substances.
Yeah.
Then when you realize, well, none of us have existence apart from God, how do we now distinguish
That's right.
from
No,
accidents?
that's a good one. And yeah, because if you just say substances are independent, then you realize, well, actually, they aren't, right? Because they all depend on God. Okay. So the way I put this, and this is actually okay, so this is related to a point I made earlier about what makes a feature essential. So an essential feature is a maximally foundational feature of a substance. Well, an essential feature of a substance is a maximally foundational feature of that substance, meaning that there's no deeper feature in the substance that explains it. And then the accidental features are features that are explained by that essential feature. Now, the difference between accidents and substances as far as dependence goes like this. Accidents depend essentially. Now, later you're going to try to trip me up and you'll be right. So, but I'm just going to keep going for now. Accidents depend essentially on substances. It's part of their essence to depend on a substance. So the yellowness of the pencil is the pencil's yellowness by its very nature. Now, what Aquinas says about the dependence of creatures on God is that it's not essential to them to depend on God. Now, of course, it's necessary for them to depend on God. It's completely, totally 1000% impossible for them to exist except depending on God. But their dependence on God is not the most basic, the most foundational fact about them.
Hmm.
This is a startling claim, but this is what he says. So if you have, I mean, to put this in sort of kind of rugged metaphysical way, a squirrel or a horse or a human or whatever, any creature, it's the sort of thing in which its nature is such that its nature or its essence is distinct from its existence. And because of that, it has to depend on something to cause it to exist. It doesn't get existence just by being the kind of thing that it is. And so that fact of dependence on God flows from, is subsequent to the kind of thing that it is. So it's actually an accident. It's dependent. It's the kind of accident that you can't not have. You have to have it. Just like a human has to have the ability to laugh. So it's a necessary accident, or in the tradition they're often called propria or proper accidents. It's a certain kind of proper accident. So it's essential to accidents to depend on substances, but It's actually just a necessary accident for substances. That's the difference.
Yeah.
But it's a very subtle difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one that definitely needs careful articulation, because if not, then it seems,
Yeah,
kind of easy to
that's
just
right.
say, okay, well, clearly we have kind of misguided views on substance and accidents. But once you kind of show the difference in the dependence, or the distinction of the dependence there,
Yeah. I mean, the way maybe you remember this, the way it flows out in the book, I sort of like raise this issue and then I go, hold on, we're not ready to answer yet. And then I think I defer it a second time. And
yeah.
then finally I say, okay, now we're ready.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think it's like in chapter 8, I think, when you speak about God, that's when we finally, um,
but does it really take that long?
maybe not. I mean,
Maybe not. Anyway,
but yeah,
probably
that's
bring
right.
it back up anyway.
Well, that's one of the great things about the book too, is that you kind of give some breadcrumbs throughout to let the reader, to guide the reader on. Um, no, this
I
is
think in a way you kind of have to, because one of the things that makes metaphysics so difficult is that every time you try to explain it, you wish you had started somewhere else because everything seems to presuppose everything else.
yeah,
So, I mean, I did my thing with starting with substance, but even there, you still have to like sometimes help yourself to something that you'll have to explain later. So you just give a quick and dirty little analysis of it, and then you come back to it later, and yeah, that's the
sure,
way it goes.
yeah. Well, I mean, Dr. Gorman, this has been great so far, and I want to at this point kind of transition just a little bit now, from the actual metaphysics itself to
Yeah,
chapter 9, where you relate
yeah,
metaphysics to two specific theological inquiries,
yeah,
and that's the incarnation of the hypostatic union, um, and is transubstantiation was
yeah,
the other case that you discussed. Before looking at those two cases specifically, I wanted to ask you. You do a great job in introducing that chapter at distinguishing theology from philosophy, and what makes those two things distinct. Um, but now I know, so for some philosophers, there's obviously those philosophers who are not Christian, let's say, are going to have the concern that in looking at metaphysics through a Christian lens, you're kind of
yeah,
importing your Christianity and revelation to philosophy, and in that sense, you're no longer doing philosophy.
yeah.
Speaking. And then on the other hand, there are some Christians who get concerned by a kind of, let's say, Hellenization of the
Right.
that nowhere in the Bible does it talk about substance and accidents. Uh,
Yes.
and so I wanted to see if you could just kind of discuss a little bit, the uh, the relationship in that sense between um, philosophy and theology, and why there isn't this kind of and maybe there might legitimately be, but to what extent is the tension that occurs when trying to have the two in dialogue with each other.
Yeah. Good. So I just made notes because that's complicated.
Yeah, sorry, that was a lot there. So pick
No,
whatever you
no,
want.
that's
And
okay. I just want to make sure I pick up on everything. So I'll start with the Hellenization worry. Right? People sometimes worry, shouldn't we just stick with the only the ideas that are in sacred scripture and not bring in all this Greek philosophy stuff? And I think that you, this won't work, um, because the Bible does not give you all the information you need in order to understand the Bible. And I want to sort of state this, like begin by making this point on like a super, super basic level. Um, so the Bible does not contain dictionaries of Hebrew and Greek into your language. So you can't, so even if you want to start with scripture in its original languages, you need to already know some languages, but the Bible does not teach those languages to you. And you say, well, fine, I'm going to read it in English, but fine, like it doesn't teach you how to read English. You had to learn that first, right? Um, or like, you're reading the Bible and it tells you a story about Jesus on a lake with some guys who are fishing. Well, what's a lake? What's fishing? The Bible doesn't explain all that stuff. So there's actually quite a lot of stuff you have to know. A lot of it is everyday stuff, so we don't notice this. But the fact is, if all you had was the Bible and you were just like an infant, you would never get anywhere. So it's always already too late. You have to bring stuff to Scripture in order to understand it. And it turns out that some things in Scripture, especially when people start asking you hard and legitimate questions about Scripture, it forces you to bring in fancier things and ultimately philosophical things. So if you look at, and this would be Aquinas' way of explaining this, I think, if you look in the Gospels, you see there's this one fellow, Jesus, and sometimes he's talked about as if he were human, and sometimes he's talked about as if he were God. Now, what are you going to do? Is it just a stupid book? Well, if you don't think that, then you're going to have to come up with some sort of explanation of what's going on here. And the explanation that the early Christians came up with was that he's one person, but in fact, he has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. So now there you are doing a little bit of Greek philosophy. You brought in these concepts of nature and person. I mean, I just made it sound easy. It took like a few hundred years of vicious disputes before they got it figured out. It was really hard. But so that's why sort of my defense of Hellenization, as you know, I can't think of where, but Pope Benedict said somewhere that maybe the reason the incarnation happened at the time that it happened was so that it's like God waited until Greek philosophy had developed enough so that we could understand what had happened. That's an amazing claim, and that might be right. That's an amazing claim. Okay, so but the other side of it is you wanted to know about whether bringing theological things into philosophy kind of corrupts philosophy. Now, this is a legitimate
If I could just
word.
if I could just motivate that
Yeah.
question a little bit more. So relating it to what you mentioned in the chapter. So taking the example of transubstantiation,
Yes.
we have this claim here earlier that okay, accidents, well, they do two things generally speaking, and
Yep.
that they contain a substance, but they also inhere in a substance as well. And so in chapter 9 on transubstantiation, we seem to get a case, at least through Revelation, where it seems okay, well,
Yep.
when during the consecration, the accidents of the bread no longer seem to inhere in the substance.
Yep.
And so if we say that and we make that claim, and then we try to kind of say, okay, well, actually,
Yep.
accidents do this thing sometimes, but in this case, they happen not to be doing that.
Right. Yep.
It almost seems like a kind of ad hoc shift,
Yeah. That's
uh,
right.
based on revelation, and so that's I guess what's motivating the question from
Yeah. No, very good. So yeah. So yeah. So if it's and it's worse if you say what I said, 10 minutes ago or whatever, that it's actually essential to them, right? So now at that, so it, so the first thing to say is if you push Aquinas, he would not actually say it's essential to accidents that they do inhere in substances. He'd say something more like this: it's essential to accidents that they can inhere in substances and that it's like their sort of natural appropriate mode. And that's not a trivial thing to say because it's not um, like substances aren't like that, right? It's not their normal mode, right, to inhere in things. So it's actually a substantive claim, but it is a slightly weaker claim, right? Instead of saying that accidents necessarily do inhere, he's just saying that um, they can inhere and it's like their proper mode. Now, if you give that as your sort of considered explanation of what a substance is, of what an accident is, it's going to turn out that it's not going to mess up the things that you wanted to say about accident. It just will make it more complicated. And so the reason I think Aquinas doesn't say it over and over and over all through all of his normal metaphysical discussions is that it would be really tedious to always keep saying that. So he usually just gives a sort of shortcut explanation. But then you might say, but wait a second, doesn't this mean that theology has come along and brought in some, yeah, as you say, ad hoc justification for changing the meaning? Now, there's two ways you could go here. One way you could go here is you could just say, look, okay, so actually, I have modified my notion of accident. But first of all, it wasn't like a dangerous modification because everything still works in my ordinary metaphysics. But also, what's so wrong with modifying my definition in the face of new facts?
Mm.
If I'm a Christian, I just think this is a thing and I got to deal with it. So, like, for a long time, I mean, this is a story that I'm sure this actually is true. It just has the ring of one of these sort of legends, but I think it probably is true that ornithologists, certainly European ornithologists, thought that swans were always white. And then they traveled down to Australia and they whoa, those things, they look like swans, but they're black. Well, they are swans. So it turned, okay, was that like an ad hoc theoretical move? Very bad? No, they were responding to reality as they saw it. That's perfectly fine. So now, of course, if you think Christianity is false, you're not going to think this is an appropriate change to make. But the problem wouldn't be that it's ad hoc. Mm-hmm. Calling it ad hoc, that's just an insult. You're just adjusting your theory to fit the facts. But I will add a complication. There's actually good reason to believe that Aquinas thinks that you can give a philosophical justification for understanding accidents in this way. He doesn't talk about it a lot outside of theological context because he doesn't really need to, but sometimes he does, and it has to do, it's this very detailed thing that I've been thinking through lately, but it has to do with the essence existence distinction and stuff. It's something that he gets from the Muslim philosopher Avicenna, so which proves that it's not that theological, right? So or it's not Christian theology, but it's not theology at all. But anyway, I think, you raised this in the context of faith and reason. I think that although it appears historically to be the case that Aquinas didn't really make this move primarily for theological reasons, if he did, so what? It's not a bad thing to change your views in accordance with what you think is true. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the debate at that point wouldn't be between, let's say, the secular metaphysician and the theologian. Wouldn't be necessarily about whether it's whether the justification is necessarily ad hoc. It's just whether the given fact that's in question is actually a genuine fact.
That's right.
And that's the real question at the heart of it.
That's right.
But the process, or what you kind of deduce from the fact, is not necessarily an issue. That's what you have to do, even as
I think that's right.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, you just made an indication now, so I don't know if you're reading my mind through the screen, but it was this question of is there kind of any out of curiosity, and I, again, if there's not, I don't think there's necessarily really a problem for the Christian, but is there any reason, let's say, for accidents to suppose that actually like the metaphysician can understand that accidents, what's essential to them is that they can inhere in a substance, not that they do inhere in a substance, that the metaphysician qua metaphysician can understand that? Or on the question of the hypostatic union, that the metaphysician can know that what's essential to let's say a rational nature is that it can constitute a person, but it doesn't need to constitute a person.
Yeah. Wait, so what's the question? I got lost.
Can the metaphysician know those two things?
Oh, I see.
And if so, if it's possible, the little time we have left, to maybe just kind of give a brief justification for why they might be able to.
Well, I think the metaphysician, okay, leaving aside the fancy thing, okay, so there's this thing that as I mentioned, that I'm working on now that has to do with whether you could root it in Aquinas' essence existence distinction. It looks like there's a pretty good case for that. I've been reading some literature on that, and trying to think it through myself. It's a project that I'm currently working on. Leaving that out, because I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say about it yet, and I'm also looking at the clock. You know,
Yeah.
leaving that. Okay, but I'll say this much: if that stuff is right, it may be that there actually is an extremely arcane philosophical argument for why those are the correct ways of thinking about these things. Leaving those aside, I think certainly a philosopher could be gotten to see that these things are possible. You should be able to see philosophically that it could be that way. It could be that there would be, this is a coherent way of thinking about accidents, and a coherent way, for the other case you mentioned, of thinking about substantial natures. But you wouldn't normally expect philosophers to come up with this idea. And so I think it's probably the case that there are metaphysical truths that are within philosophy's grasp, but philosophy is very unlikely to stumble across them unless it has an encounter with theology. And so if you were not a Christian, you might go, oh, I never thought of that. You guys have weird views. I cannot share that Christian stuff. But I see what you're saying. I never thought of that one before. I think that might be the situation in some cases.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that, and if anything, I think what that does, it shows to also to Christians who might be generally worried about the, let's say, the primacy of philosophy over theology, or that
Yes.
actually you just only believe in a God of the philosophers, and you're just trying to kind of import that into Scripture in some way. That it shows that no, actually, genuinely, theology does bear its own kind of fruits upon philosophy.
Yes.
You to bring philosophy to a place that it would be very, if not impossible, be very difficult for the philosopher to be.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. And it can't just be a coincidence that so much good philosophy was done by theologians who were worried about theological problems, because the theological mysteries that they were trying to understand forced them to rethink what's going on at the natural level, because it seemed to suggest that things are possible that you wouldn't have thought were possible. And if you're somebody like Aquinas, you're not going to say, oh, well, God just violates the natures of things, whatever, because like you can't do that. You can't have like a non-rational human, because then it wouldn't be human. God doesn't, whatever you would mean by a theological mystery or something being miraculous, it's not that you're violating the law of non-contradiction. So that means if you take seriously the idea that these theological mysteries are really things that are true, that means you got to rethink what's actually possible, which means you got to rethink the natures of things. So you're pushed hard by theology to do philosophy one level deeper.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Dr. Gorman, thank you very much for your time. One final softball question that I've been asking to different guests is, besides Aquinas, who is your favorite philosopher and or theologian?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, is that a softball question?
I don't know.
I don't know. Can I give a really shallow answer? Maybe it's not a shallow answer. But this is a philosopher that with some friends I'm reading some of right now, and I just want to flag him as a really good philosophical writer. I mean, I also think he's a good philosopher, but he's a really good stylist. Is Peter Strawson. That guy can write philosophical English like nobody's business. Very elegant, very clear. He's always writing these long, complicated sentences, but they're totally comprehensible. And at the end, you're like, I can't believe he pulled that one off. So that's maybe kind of shallow, but in another way, I think it's good for philosophy and theology to be written in a nice, clear way. I think that's important.
That's right, and I think you excel at that in your book, Contemporary Introduction to Thomistic Metaphysics. So again, I can't recommend this enough to anybody watching. Definitely get a copy. I think you can get a copy on Amazon, and on I think CUA Press as well.
That's the publisher.
So go ahead,
No,
get your copy. And Dr. Gorman, thank you again so much for.
thanks so very much. That was fun.